Hey everyone, how's it going? We've just heard the Liberal government's federal economic update. This is one of 2 times in the year where we get information about what they're doing with their money, and we're going to go over some of the notes here. I've just finished watching the whole thing on the live stream, and now we're going to go over these notes, a summary of what was just said, and some main key takeaways, as well as what the other parties have to say about it, some of the major problems that they had with it, because this was rather shocking, and we'll get to the reason why economic update here. Okay, getting to the top of my notes here. Here is the mini budget. So Krista Freeland started off by saying that she's visited a bunch of people and places across Canada, and she's talked to them about the high cost of living. The high cost of living. This is a big problem here in Canada. She brought up what the Liberals constantly bring up, is that global inflation isn't created by any one government, but by the actions of many governments. This is a sort of way of saying, hey, well, we're not the ones responsible for the high cost of living, but they are the ones responsible for solving it, for doing something about it. She says inflation was 6.9%, and it's on a falling trajectory, and it's lower than other countries, but people are still struggling. So a little bit more of saying, hey, this isn't totally our fault, and actually we're kind of in an okay position compared to other people. Of course, anyone in power would say, well, look, we're in a better position than other people. Then she tried to get real, said, it's important to be honest, things are going to be rough over the next while. Interest rates are rising. They're going to continue to rise as the Bank of Canada tries to fight inflation, and people are going to have to sort of buckle up, and things might get worse here over the next little while. She even says in the budget that we could be entering a recessionary period here. Although she says we're ready because we've invested in the social safety net. And then she goes on to list a number of programs that we already know about that have added to this social safety net, the Canada Child Benefit, the Student Loans Program, and Enhanced Canada's Worker Benefit. And she also brings up the point that all of these things are indexed to inflation, so as we have more inflation, those numbers go up for the amount that people get. And then she goes on to deliver this sort of highlights package from this budget, the main thing that she wants people to focus on. Some of them are new, only a couple of them really, and some of them are sort of repackaging of things that we already knew were coming. She addresses the reason for that after she gets questioned about it, and we'll get into that in a second. But first things first, this sort of laundry list of new things. The first one is that they're working to deliver lower credit card fees. You might have heard about the controversy about individual retailers and stores trying to pass on the credit card fees to individuals. Now that is legal in Canada, having the additional credit card fee for using your credit card in a store. And they say we're going to try to deal with that. We'll get into more details in the coming days about the specifics once I get a chance to comb through this big old document and break it down for you. The next one, taxes on share buybacks. This is one we expected to see. Talked about it in my most recent video just before the live stream, saying that these tax on share buybacks would be in this budget. A lot of people were looking for a windfall tax on excess profits to try to sort of gather more money for the government to put out social programs. This is what the NDP wanted, but we did not see that. The tax on share buybacks is essentially when a company is doing really well, they'll buy back shares in their company to essentially reduce the supply of shares on the market, essentially making each individual share more valuable to anyone that holds it. So it's a shareholder appreciation, like they'll do something good for their shareholders if they do well. So the government thinks that they'll make money from gathering this shareholder buyback tax, and also incentivize companies to invest more instead of doing these share buybacks, building more jobs in Canada. She says there's going to be a multi-generational housing tax credit, essentially trying to retrofit homes to fit more multi-generational families and more families living together across multiple generations. She said that they're going to tackle housing speculation. Again, we're going to get into the details and if they're doing anything new, but they've said they're going to tackle housing speculation a lot. Maybe this is an additional tax on vacant properties like they've done in Vancouver and now have implemented on a larger basis, but we'll get more into into that in more detail in the coming days, so make sure to subscribe if you haven't already done so. Moving on, she brings up again the new tax-free first home savings account. She says new, but this was announced actually, I think this was part of the Liberals campaign a year ago when we all went and voted. They said that they were going to bring this in. It's still not implemented yet. There are videos on the channel here. You can search Russell Matthews tax-free first home savings account, or TFHSA, and I have a detailed breakdown on how it's going to work, but no date yet on when it will be implemented to the best of my knowledge. Next, they said, and this was received with applause by the rest of the Liberal government, is that they're permanently eliminating interest on the federal portion of student loans. So different provinces have different systems for student loans. Essentially, they're saying, hey, we're going to give you this money, and while you're trying to pay it back after you finish your school, we're not going to charge you interest on that. However, that is just the federal portion. Most of the student loan is provincial, so it's really not as impactful as you might think or as it might sound. The next one is a new quarterly Canada Workers Benefit, supporting 4.2 million Canadians, she says. The Canada Workers Benefit has been around for a long time, supporting a lot of workers who don't make as much money on the lower end of the income spectrum, helping to top them up. The one major change here is that this used to be a tax benefit or a tax rebate. So you could only do it at the end of the fiscal year, right? Around April, when you're putting in your taxes, you would get more money back because you would be able to apply this tax credit. Now they're changing it to more of a benefit where you'll it looks like you're going to be able to qualify for this benefit based on the previous year's income, and then you'll actually get quarterly checks in the mail for the amount that you would have received in a lump sum. But it doesn't look like there's any enhancement here or any boost to the amount that you would get. And then she brings up the things that have already come into effect and actually start tomorrow, which is the doubling of the GST. Happened with Bill C-30 when that passed. 11 million households who receive GST rebates. Well, those checks are going to start tomorrow as of Friday, and the people will receive a doubling of the typical GST tax credit or rebate that they would be getting, not tax credit. All right, so then she gets into the fact, like that's the laundry list of things, but then she goes into more detail on some of them, so let's get into that now. We're providing targeted inflation relief, she says. We will not make the Bank of Canada's job harder. This is what the IMF warned Canada about, was make sure you're not spending too much because you're going to be counteracting what the Bank of Canada is trying to do, raising interest rates to destroy demand in the economy. Higher interest rates means people feel more strapped for cash. They have to pay more into their mortgages, so there's less money to go into other things, meaning there's less demand in the economy, meaning that there's not as much demand to buy goods and services, meaning those prices tend to have a downward pressure fighting against inflation, right? Inflation brings the cost of things up. They want to destroy the demand so that the cost of things comes down and we don't experience long-term inflation. She brings up, again, the fact that we have the lowest debt to GDP in the G7, saying, hey, things aren't as bad as they look because compared to other people, we're looking okay. Some people will sort of scoff at that a little bit, but this is what she said. We're now charting a fiscally responsible course, and the deficit is now only 1% of GDP. She says this is good because the pandemic spending actually worked. We had a GDP bounce back, more productivity. We kept a lot of our jobs. She says we, the Liberals, did a great job, and we got through this, and that is why we're in a positive position. Now, some people will argue that the government is in a better financial position for less savory reasons. One being the fact that there is such high inflation means that the dollars that we're paying in tax are greater, right? If a good is more expensive, you pay more GST on that. That goes to the government. It puts them in a better financial position. So in some ways, inflation is good for the Canadian government, along with one of our largest industries, oil, because obviously of the global conflicts, we have an increase in oil prices, and Canada makes more money on their oil, and the government can tax on that oil more. GDP looks better because of that. So that's something to consider. And she says we're going to be able to support in the future because we're keeping our powder dry today. Keeping our powder dry today. That's something that we should sort of emphasize here, because she does hint that, and she even says this explicitly at one point in the speech, that there will be more announcements coming soon. In the days and weeks and months to come, there will be more. No clarity on what this means, but she says because we're keeping our powder dry or our cash dry today, we're not spending spending it all. We're not blowing it all right now. We're going to be able to actually spend in the future, and more supports for Canadians could be coming in the future. But again, very cloudy, very gray, not really clear here. She says we're going to focus on our minerals and natural resources to power the global net zero transition. She says we're in a good position because a lot of the things our allies need, they're turning away from Russia, and we kind of have some of the similar things that Russia had. So this is a good thing for our economy. We can grow to mine and process minerals, and seizing this opportunity is what she says we did in April when the last budget happened. They're going to add more tax credits and more money for companies that mine and process clean energy, energy goods. We're talking like lithium batteries, things to go in electric cars, processing there. That's where they're focusing all of their tax credits and incentives, is to help with that industry and transitioning away from the oil industry into more green, clean tech. And she also mentions the immigration plan that was just released, 1.4 million Canadians added to the country over the next 3 years, saying that we're going to help bring workers in specifically for these industries and for industries to help build more homes and nursing and doctors. This is what the Liberal plan is currently. And she says there's going to be more good jobs for Canadians because we're making these investments into clean energy. A lot of focus on clean energy here. And then she brings up a criticism of the Conservatives, saying workers know that we Liberals will never attack EI and CPP. That's the Employment Insurance and Canada Pension Plan. It's important. We'll never attack it. This comes on the back of the Conservatives attacking the Liberals a little bit, saying, hey, you need to pause all tax increases for the foreseeable future because people can't make ends meet. And this is, they're criticizing the EI and CPP contribution increase that's scheduled. But the Liberals say, hey, we know the social safety net is important, so we're not going to listen to what the Conservatives are saying in this instance. And she says the biggest difference that helps you in the economy is having a good job that you like with people who respect you. And our goal during the pandemic was to keep those jobs around. And because we're being such a strong industrial government, we're going to bring in more private investment to create good paying jobs. There's a Canadian Growth Fund that's being created to help sort of maybe some sort of matching program to bring in foreign investment or private investment rather, to build more companies, build more jobs, and they say we're going to help these companies grow by giving them taxpayer dollars. And so that is essentially her portion of the speech. Freeland got into a bunch of stuff, but it was a lot of it a repackaging of what she said in April. So a lot of people might be a little bit frustrated by this, the fact that there was nothing new, and certainly the members of the opposition party, the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois and the NDP, they all seemed pretty underwhelmed because it was a repackaging. Freeland got back to them saying, hey, this is just a fall economic update. I'm not going to bring a whole bunch of new stuff. I do that in April. So, but it was kind of an underwhelming response. But we're going to get into some of these critiques. One of the ones from the Conservatives is that they didn't cancel the carbon tax on home heating despite the potential 50 to 100% increase that we could see this winter with soaring energy prices. To this, she didn't really respond to the carbon tax criticism. She just said, hey, we understand times are tough, but you're going to get the GST credit tomorrow starting then. This is a meaningful help along with the $500 for renters. Again, something that was or is in the process of being passed in Bill C-31. Again, I'm going to keep on going here, but if you want to stay up to date with everything that's been going on in Canada, subscribe to the channel because I'm going to get way more into detail in the coming days and weeks. And then we go on to the Bloc Québécois, who says, well, we look for what's new in this budget and there isn't anything. Where is the EI reform? A lot of people have been calling out Carla Qualtrough, who is the Minister for Disability Inclusion and Employment in Canada. A lot of people are kind of pissed at her for two different reasons. One, there is no employment insurance reform, and it doesn't look like we're going to see that for another 6 months, despite the Liberal government saying for essentially 7 years, we're going to reform EI to make it so that less people fall through the cracks. This could be especially important if, as the Bank of Canada raises interest rates, it will lower the amount of job availability, and people could end up losing their jobs as a result of an over-tightening of the Bank of Canada of interest rates. So this is something that is especially pressing right now, but nothing about it in the budget. Carla Qualtrough has constantly been saying, we're updating it, we're doing it, we're going to reform EI and make it so that gig workers can apply, and all sorts of Canadians will be able to rely on EI in a worst case scenario. She's been saying this, but we have no information on the status of that, and especially in the past 2 years since we had to change EI temporarily for COVID when all these people lost their jobs, it became very clear that the EI system would have been very broken if we hadn't have created CERB and CRB. So they need to create some sort of reform here, and it wasn't in this budget. Very disappointing for a lot of people. But again, Chrystia Freeland sort of chimed in there saying, hey, remember, I will be announcing major new measures in the days and weeks to come, but no details about that. Okay, then we get into the NDP's criticism. They say there's a lot of measures in this budget that are familiar to us because you just repackaged the things we've been talking about. You might remember the NDP and the Liberals have a sort of, not a coalition, Pierre Poilievre likes to call it a coalition because they're kind of propping each other up, but it's not a formal coalition. The NDP agreed to vote in favor of all of the Liberals' bills as long as they how do I phrase this? As long as they work in certain NDP demands into these bills, one of them being the dental care plan that they're bringing in right now. He says that was the only reference to healthcare in there. We like to see it, but dental was the only thing in there, and that was basically just because we were pressuring you. Where's your support for Canadians? Are you only going to do things when we force you to? Otherwise, there's going to be an election. That's what he's saying. And today was an opportunity to actually add something to help people. While he says Loblaws is making $1 million in excess profits per day. This is what Daniel Blakey, the NDP member of parliament, said. Where's the price fixing solutions? Where's the windfall tax? Where's a removal of GST home heating? This is something that the Conservatives and the NDP seem like they're actually working together on, that they're against the Liberals charging GST or any sort of tax on Canadians heating their homes. The Conservatives are more worried about the carbon tax side of things. The NDP are more worried about just removing the GST. But either way, they both are like, Liberals, what the hell? You're not doing anything here to help Canadians over the winter, even though other countries are. And he brings up the whole EI plan as well and how that's a big issue. And then the response to this is from Freeland, and she says, hey, one of the themes is that we're supporting working Canadians, or we're moving this Canada Workers Benefits to an advance payment, the quarterly payment instead of the tax rebate. So it kind of just repeats what she's previously said while not addressing the question. Then it came to Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, who gave quite a long and impassioned speech about all the problems with this budget and all of the ways that he would solve things. I'm going to sort of skim over this, but we could do a sort of mashup or update video here in the future that gets more into detail of it. But he says essentially, we're not going to support this budget. It's an inflationary scheme, there's bigger problems here that aren't being addressed. He's saying that there's a big housing problem because municipal and provincial governments aren't incentivized to make it quick for people to get building permits. He says that when he's prime minister, his words, that they'll be able to tie funding to the amount of houses that are actually produced, saying, hey, you're not getting any federal money, provinces or municipalities, unless you actually build more homes. This is one of the things that he talks about. He also goes into the money printing and sort of central bank criticism in one of the best explanations of what QE is, or quantitative easing is, that I've heard from a politician. Essentially the way that the Bank of Canada adds money to the system by buying Government of Canada bonds on the secondary market. I've made a video about that here on the channel, so you can check that out if you want to learn more about quantitative easing. He says this is a big problem, but as a solution, when Conservatives are in power, he says we're going to bring in a pay-as-you-go system. Every dollar that we end up spending, we got to find a dollar to cut somewhere, just like any other typical individual's budget works. Lots of people who follow modern monetary theory will say, hey, you shouldn't manage a government's pocketbook the same way you do an individual's, but that's a debate for another day. He says we'll get the Bank of Canada back to its core mandate of getting to 2% inflation and keeping it there, and we're auditing the central bank so that we can't do QE in the future. That's quantitative easing. He says, yes, we want to tackle climate change, but not with a stick, but with a carrot, incentivizing nuclear and other energy sources and cutting down on red tape for dams in Quebec, reforming tax and benefits so that when you take on more shifts and work to make more money, you'll not get that money clawed back. This is something that I think a lot of people who may be familiar with employment insurance or disability benefits might be familiar with. Oftentimes, people will find themselves not incentivized to go back to work because once they make a certain amount or once they make $1, every dollar they make gets paid back to the EI program because it says, hey, you're working now, you don't need as much support. But as a result, people are incentivized to not go back to work because every dollar they make is really only 50 cents or potentially 25 cents because it's getting paid back into a program. He says, we're going to reform these taxes and benefits so that people are actually incentivized to go back and work. If you want to take on an extra shift, you're going to be making more money, as much money as you plan to when you take on that extra shift, because we're going to remove these clawbacks. Okay, that was most of Pierre Poilievre's points there. Daniel Blakey got back up saying that he wants to work with the Conservatives to remove the home heating tax. And then Gabriel Saint-Marie, the Bloc Québécois member of parliament, says that this country is facing a risk of a recession, but looking at the document, there's not much in here. There's no solutions for it. Back in April, when the budget was presented, the government of Canada didn't mention a recession in the budget. They didn't mention inflation in the budget. But in this economic update, this mini budget, they've said, hey, there is inflation, there is a recession looming, or perhaps we're already in one. It's just 3/4 of negative or even growth of Canadian GDP. He says, even though you talked about two different situations, not mentioning inflation and now mentioning it, you just have all the same measures in here that you did last time. So it's good rhetoric. You're saying, yes, we recognize it, but you're not doing anything different to solve it. So that is the end of my notes. I need to take a drink of water here because that was a lot of talking for 10 minutes. Was that 10 minutes, 12 minutes? I don't know, but I think we're going to call this video here. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, because we're going to be more in depth on these topics, figuring out exactly what this means for you and your money in the days and weeks to come. So with all that said, thanks so much for watching. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.